Have you ever been made to feel worthless by someone who believed their success made them superior? Tonight's story explores the depths of humiliation and the transformative power of grace. When a man who was trampled upon must choose whether to extend mercy to the very person who crushed his dignity. This is a tale about what it truly means to love those who despise us, and how one decision in the darkest hour can illuminate the difference between revenge and redemption. The wrench slipped. Thomas Brennan caught it before it hit the concrete floor of his small garage, his calloused fingers closing around the cold metal with practiced ease. 47 years of life had taught him to catch things before they fell. Tools, hopes, his daughter's tears when her mother left them both 12 years ago. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the gutted engine of a 1978 pickup truck that had seen better decades. Grease streaked Thomas's grey coveralls, and the small silver cross hanging from a thin chain around his neck caught the light as he bent back over the engine block. Outside, the October rain hammered Riverside with relentless fury, turning the streets into rivers and the sky into a bruised canvas of purple and black. Water streamed down the garage's single window, distorting the world beyond into an impressionist painting of blurred headlights and drowning colors. Thomas had sent his assistant home 2 hours ago. The kid had a young family, and the storm was only getting worse. Besides, Thomas preferred the solitude of late-night repairs. There was something almost meditative about the work. The logic of pistons and cylinders, the honest language of metal and motion. The bell above the garage door chimed, and Thomas straightened, his lower back protesting with a familiar ache. A man stood in the doorway, rain dripping from his expensive black suit onto the oil-stained floor. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair slicked back in a style that screamed money and effort, his jaw clean-shaven and sharp enough to cut glass. He held a set of keys in one manicured hand, dangling them like a teacher might dangle a disappointing test score. "Are you the mechanic?" The man's voice carried the crisp edges of someone who had never been told no. "Thomas Brennan. What can I do for you?" Thomas wiped his hands on a rag that had long ago surrendered to permanent grime. The man walked in without invitation, his polished leather shoes clicking against the concrete with each step. He moved through the garage like he was inspecting a hotel room that had failed to meet his standards, his eyes scanning the cluttered workbenches, the calendar on the wall still showing September, the coffee mug that said, "World's okayest dad," that his daughter Melissa had given him as a joke 3 birthdays ago. "My car's making a noise," a clicking sound from the engine. The man stopped in front of Thomas, close enough that Thomas could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than Thomas made in a week. "I need it fixed tonight." Thomas glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:47. "It's pretty late, Mr. Ashford, Gregory Ashford." The man said his name like it should mean something, like it should open doors and bend rules. "And I'm aware of the time. That's why I'll pay double your usual rate." Money. Thomas thought of Melissa's college tuition, due in 2 weeks. He thought of the medical bills still arriving from his father's final stay in the hospital last spring, each one a paper reminder that death was expensive. He thought of the leak in his apartment's ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix, but never did. "Let me take a look," Thomas said, reaching for his jacket. Gregory led him outside to a gleaming black luxury sedan parked at an angle that blocked half the street. Rain soaked through Thomas's jacket within seconds, cold water finding every gap and seam. He popped the hood and peered into the engine compartment with his flashlight, rain spattering against the hot metal and hissing into steam. The clicking was obvious. A loose timing belt tensioner, probably 15 minutes of work in dry conditions. In this storm, maybe 30. "It's your timing belt tensioner," Thomas called over the rain. "I can fix it, but I'll need to bring the car into the garage. It'll take about half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Gregory checked his watch, a thin golden thing that probably cost more than Thomas's car. "Fine, but I'm not paying for incompetence if it takes longer." Thomas bit back the first three responses that came to mind. Instead, he nodded and climbed into the driver's seat, the leather interior so plush it felt like sitting on a cloud made of money. He carefully maneuvered the car into the garage, parking it under the brightest lights. Gregory followed, standing just inside the door, arms crossed, radiating impatience. Thomas gathered his tools, laying them out with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for an operation. He could feel Gregory's eyes on him, watching, judging. The weight of that gaze made his hands want to shake, but he steadied them through sheer will. He had fixed engines in worse conditions, in winter storms, in summer heat, that turned the garage into an oven, in the weeks after his wife left, when his own hands had trembled with grief and exhaustion. "You've been doing this long?" Gregory asked, his tone suggesting the question was rhetorical, that he had already decided the answer was, too long to be doing anything this menial. 29 years, Thomas replied, not looking up from the engine. 29 years, and this is where you ended up. Not a question, a statement, a judgment rendered and delivered. Ever think about doing something more with your life? Thomas's jaw tightened. His fingers found the tensioner bolt, began working it loose. I fix things. It's honest work. Honest, Gregory laughed, a short bark of sound that held no humor. That's what people say when they've given up on being successful. My father used to say that his work was honest. He was a janitor, spent his whole life cleaning other people's messes for minimum wage, and he called it honest work, like that made it noble. The bolt came free. Thomas reached for the replacement tensioner, his movement steady despite the anger building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. He died with nothing, Gregory continued, his voice gaining momentum, warming to his subject. No savings, no property, nothing to show for 40 years of labor except a bad back and lungs full of cleaning chemicals. But it was honest work, right? That's supposed to be enough? Thomas installed the new tensioner, his hands working automatically while his mind retreated to a place where Gregory's words couldn't reach. He thought about his own father, who had worked in a factory for 33 years, who had come home every night smelling of machine oil and metal shavings, who had taught Thomas everything he knew about engines and fixing things and being a man who kept his word. I decided I'd never end up like him, Gregory said. So I studied. I worked. I built something. I'm a financial consultant now. I help people grow their wealth, multiply their investments. Last year alone, I made 7 figures. 7. And you know what? I earned every penny of it because I refused to settle for honest work when I could have important work instead. The new tensioner was in place. Thomas tightened the bolt, checking the tension with practiced fingers. Almost done. Just a few more minutes and Gregory Ashford could take his money and his contempt and drive away into the rain. But people like you, Gregory continued, and Thomas realized with dawning horror that the man wasn't going to stop, that he needed this. Needed to pour out his poison like a wound that had to drain. You're happy being small. You're content with your little garage and your little life, fixing other people's cars while they drive off to do important things. You probably tell yourself you're satisfied, that money isn't everything, that there's dignity in manual labor. Thomas said nothing. He lowered the hood, the sound of metal meeting metal echoing through the garage like a period at the end of a sentence. There's no dignity in being poor, Gregory said, his voice softening into something almost pitying, which was somehow worse than the contempt. There's just poverty with better branding. You want to know the real difference between people like me and people like you. People like me make choices. People like you make excuses. Thomas walked to his workbench, writing up the invoice with mechanical precision. His handwriting was steady, each number and letter formed with care. Labor, $150. Parts, $45. Total, $195. He held out the invoice without looking at Gregory's face. Gregory took it, pulled out his wallet, black leather, fat with bills and cards, and counted out $400 bills. He pressed them into Thomas's palm. Keep the change. Consider it charity from someone who actually made something of himself. Thomas stood there, the bills damp with rain and contempt in his hand, and felt something inside him crack, not break. He had been broken before, and he knew what that felt like. This was different. This was smaller, quieter, but somehow more permanent, like a hairline fracture in a foundation that would never quite heal right. Gregory climbed into his car, started the engine, and listened. The clicking was gone, replaced by the smooth purr of precision machinery. He smiled, not at Thomas, but at the validation of his own superiority, and drove out into the rain without another word, without even a thank you. Thomas stood in the empty garage, listening to the rain, holding $400 that felt like 30 pieces of silver in his hand. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The cross around his neck seemed heavier than usual, pulling at his neck like a question that demanded an answer. He thought about his father, who had died 3 months after retirement, too tired to enjoy the freedom he had worked his whole life to earn. He thought about his daughter, studying pre-med at the state university, determined to help people, to heal them. He thought about his wife, who had left because she wanted more, wanted bigger, wanted things he could not give her. He thought about words like dignity and honesty and the quiet violence of someone looking at your life and finding it wanting. Thomas locked the garage door, pocketed the money, he would need it, no matter how it burned in his pocket, and walked out into the rain toward his apartment 6 blocks away. His car was at home. He always walked to work when the weather was decent. Tonight, the rain was not decent, but he walked anyway, because the water was cold and clean, and maybe it could wash away the feeling that Gregory had been right about him all along. The cross around his neck bounced against his chest with each step, a small rhythm of silver and faith that he had worn for so long he usually forgot it was there. His father had given it to him on his 18th birthday, the same day Thomas had decided not to go to college, had chosen instead to apprentice at Old Man Henderson's garage. His father had not argued, had not expressed disappointment. He had simply placed the cross in Thomas's hand and said, "Wherever you go, whatever you do, remember who you belong to." Thomas had not always been sure what that meant. Tonight, walking through the rain with the taste of humiliation still bitter in his mouth, he was even less sure. His apartment was dark when he arrived, water dripping from his clothes onto the linoleum floor of the narrow entryway. Melissa was at school, 3 hours away, living in a dorm and studying for midterms. The apartment felt larger without her, emptier, like a church after the congregation has left, and only the echoes remain. Thomas stripped out of his wet clothes, hung them in the bathroom to dry, and stood under the shower for 20 minutes, letting hot water drum against his skull until his skin turned pink. He thought about Gregory's words, turning them over in his mind like stones in a tumbler, examining them from every angle. The worst part was not the cruelty. He had encountered cruel people before. The worst part was the kernel of truth buried in the poison. He was 47 years old. He owned no property. His savings account held $1,700. His daughter's tuition cost $32,000 a year, and they were making it work through a combination of scholarships, loans, and his monthly payments that left him eating soup and sandwiches most nights. He drove a car that was older than most of his daughter's friends. He lived in an apartment that smelled like the fried food from the restaurant downstairs. Was this what his father's honest work had earned? Was this what his own 29 years of labor had built? Thomas dried off, dressed in sweatpants and an old t-shirt, and sat on his couch with a cup of tea growing cold between his hands. The television was off. The only sound was the rain against the window and the occasional creak of old pipes in the walls. He should eat something. He should call Melissa, just to hear her voice. He should do any number of normal things that normal people did on normal Thursday nights. Instead, he sat in the dark and felt small. The phone rang at 2:14 in the morning. Thomas jerked awake, his neck stiff from falling asleep on the couch at an awkward angle. The phone rang again, shrill and insistent in the darkness. He fumbled for it, his fingers clumsy with sleep. Hello? Is this Thomas Brennan, the mechanic? A woman's voice, tight with controlled panic. Yes. Who is this? My name is Patricia Ashford. I'm calling from Highway 12, about 15 miles south of Riverside. There's been an accident. My brother's car went off the road. He's trapped inside and the car is filling with water. He said you just fixed his car tonight and your number was still on his phone. I don't know what to do. The emergency services say they can't get here for at least 40 minutes because of the flooding, and the water is rising, and Thomas was already moving, pulling on his boots, grabbing his jacket. Is the car submerged? Half submerged. It's in a drainage ditch. The water is up to the windows. He can't open the doors. The electronic locks are shorted out or something, and the water pressure is too strong. The windows won't open either. We tried breaking them, but there's some kind of reinforced glass and we don't have anything heavy enough. Is he injured? I don't know. He's conscious, but he's panicking. The water is still rising. Please, if you have any tools, anything that could help, I'm coming. Stay on the line with him. Tell him to move to the back seat where the water is lower. Tell him to take slow breaths. I'm 15 minutes away. Thomas hung up and stared at his phone for 3 seconds. Gregory Ashford. The man who had looked at Thomas's life and found it contemptible, the man who had paid him in charity and cruelty. That man was trapped in a car that was slowly becoming a coffin, and Thomas was the only person within 40 minutes who had the tools and knowledge to save him. The right thing to do was obvious. The easy thing to do was nothing. Thomas grabbed his keys and ran to his truck. The rain had not lessened. If anything, it had grown worse. A deluge that turned the world into a grey curtain of water and limited visibility to perhaps 30 feet. Thomas drove with his hazard lights on, pushing his old truck as fast as he dared on roads that had become rivers. His windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the onslaught, barely keeping up. His mind raced faster than the truck. He thought about drowning, about the rising water, about the panic that would set in as a person realized they were going to die in a metal box of their own luxury. He thought about Gregory's face, the contempt in his eyes, the casual dismissal of Thomas's entire existence. He thought about his father's voice. Wherever you go, whatever you do, remember who you belong to. He thought about the teachings he had heard his whole life, words that sounded beautiful in church, but brutal in practice. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive 70 times, 7 times. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Easy words when your enemies were abstract concepts. Harder when they had names and faces and had recently called your life meaningless. Thomas gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. The cross around his neck seemed to burn against his skin, a brand of expectation and obligation. I don't want to save him, Thomas said aloud to the empty truck, to the rain, to whatever was listening. I don't want to risk my life for someone who thinks I'm worthless. The rain answered with indifferent fury. But I'm going to anyway, Thomas continued, his voice breaking slightly, because if I don't, I'm not who I claim to be. If I don't, then every prayer I've ever prayed was a lie, and every time I've worn this cross was just jewelry, just metal and meaning I didn't earn. He pressed harder on the accelerator. Highway 12 was a 2-lane road that wound through farmland and forest on the outskirts of Riverside. During normal weather, it was a pleasant drive. Tonight, it was apocalyptic. Water flowed across the asphalt in sheets, and Thomas could see where the road had washed away entirely in places, leaving raw gaps of mud and churning water. He drove carefully, testing the ground before committing to it, aware that one wrong move would send him into the same fate awaiting Gregory. He saw the headlights ahead, a car pulled to the side of the road, hazard lights blinking orange in the darkness. Thomas pulled up behind it and killed his engine. A woman climbed out of the car, rain immediately plastering her dark hair to her skull. She looked like Gregory, same sharp features, same expensive clothes now ruined by mud and water. "Are you Thomas?" she called over the storm. "Where is he?" She pointed down the embankment, and Thomas's stomach dropped. The drainage ditch ran parallel to the road, usually a trickle of water no more than 2 feet deep. Tonight it was a raging river, and in the middle of it, canted at a 45-degree angle, was Gregory's black sedan. Water had risen to cover the front half of the car completely, and Thomas could see it creeping higher by the minute, now lapping at the bottom of the rear windows. Thomas grabbed his toolbox from the truck bed, the heavy metal case splashing into ankle-deep water. He started down the embankment, his boots immediately sinking into mud that tried to claim them. "Wait!" Patricia called after him. "The current is too strong. You'll be swept away." "Then I'll be swept away," Thomas called back, not slowing down. The water hit him mid-thigh before he reached the car, cold enough to steal his breath. The current tugged at his legs, insistent and powerful, and he had to lean into it to keep his footing. The car was listing badly, its front end nose down in the deeper water, the rear tires barely touching the ground. Through the rain-streaked windows, Thomas could see Gregory in the back seat, his face pale and wild with fear, his suit jacket discarded, his white shirt clinging to his chest. Their eyes met through the glass. Thomas saw recognition flash across Gregory's face, followed by something that might have been shame or hope or terror, or perhaps all three at once. Thomas waded closer, fighting the current with every step. The water reached his waist, then his chest. His toolbox felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The cold was shocking, penetrating, the kind of cold that made thinking difficult and movement sluggish. He reached the car and pressed his face to the rear window. Water had risen to the seat level inside, maybe 8 inches deep. Gregory's hands were bleeding. He had clearly tried to break the windows himself, battering them with something until his knuckles split. Thomas pointed at the window, then at his toolbox, miming what he was going to do. Gregory nodded frantically, his lips moving in words Thomas couldn't hear, but could easily guess. "Please, help me, I'm sorry, please." Thomas pulled out a tire iron from his toolbox, hefting its weight. The reinforced glass would not break easily, but it would break if hit in the right spot, the corner where the stress would fracture the entire pane. He had to time it perfectly. If he broke the window while standing in front of it, the water would rush in too fast, and both he and Gregory would be swept away by the force of it. Thomas moved to the side of the car, bracing his feet against the current. He raised the tire iron, aimed carefully, and swung with every ounce of strength he possessed. The glass held. He swung again. A crack appeared, spiderwebbing across the surface. Third swing. The window exploded inward with a sound like a gunshot, and water immediately began pouring into the car with terrifying speed. "Move!" Thomas screamed, though he didn't know if Gregory could hear him. Gregory was already moving, climbing over the seat toward the broken window. Water was flooding in. The car was shifting, tilting further, and Thomas knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the entire vehicle was swept downstream. Gregory's head emerged through the window, his shoulders, and then he was stuck. The opening was too small, or he was too panicked, or the water pressure was too strong. Thomas grabbed his arm, pulled with everything he had, felt the man's shirt tear as he yanked him through the jagged opening. They fell together into the churning water, and for a moment Thomas lost all sense of direction. The current grabbed them both, spinning them, pulling them under. Thomas's head went underwater, and he tasted mud and rain and the metallic tang of fear. His hand still gripped Gregory's arm, refusing to let go even as the water tried to pry them apart. Thomas's feet found purchase on something, a rock, a root, something solid enough to push against. He shoved upward, breaking the surface, gasping for air. Gregory's head emerged beside him, coughing and sputtering. "The bank!" Thomas shouted. "Swim for the bank!" It was less swimming than controlled drowning, a desperate thrashing toward the shore that seemed impossibly far away. Thomas kept one hand on Gregory, pulling him along, even though his arms screamed with exhaustion and his lungs burned with the effort of breathing in the rain. Patricia was there somehow, knee-deep in the water at the edge, reaching out. Thomas pushed Gregory toward her, watched her grab her brother's hand, and pull him onto solid ground. Then Thomas's own hands found mud and grass, and he crawled out of the water on hands and knees, collapsing onto the embankment like a fish that had learned to breathe air. For a long moment, there was only the sound of 3 people breathing, harsh and ragged, mixed with the relentless percussion of rain. Thomas rolled onto his back, staring up at the black sky, watching rain fall into his eyes. His entire body hurt, his hands were numb. His lungs felt like they had been scraped raw from the inside. He was alive. Gregory was alive. That would have to be enough. You saved him. Patricia's voice choked with tears and rain and disbelief. You actually came. You saved him. Thomas sat up slowly, his muscles protesting. Gregory was sitting a few feet away, his arms wrapped around his knees, shaking violently from cold or shock or both. His perfect hair was plastered to his skull, and his expensive clothes were ruined, and he looked nothing like the man who had stood in Thomas's garage a few hours ago, radiating superiority and contempt. He looked human, small, fragile. Gregory's eyes found Thomas's across the darkness and rain. Why? Gregory's voice was barely audible. After what I said to you, why did you come? Thomas was silent for a long moment, trying to find words for something that had no easy explanation. Finally, he reached up and touched the cross around his neck, the small piece of silver that had somehow survived the water, the current, the violence of the rescue. Because, Thomas said, his voice rough and tired, someone once told me that the measure of a man isn't what he does for the people who deserve it. It's what he does for the people who don't. Gregory's face crumpled. He buried his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook with sobs that had nothing to do with the cold. Patricia helped Thomas to his feet. We need to get you both to a hospital. You're going into shock. I'm fine, Thomas said, though he was not fine. He was soaked and freezing and exhausted down to his bones. But he was also something else, something he couldn't quite name, but could feel settling into his chest like warmth, like peace, like the answer to a question he had been asking his whole life without knowing it. They made their way back up the embankment to the cars. Patricia wrapped both men in emergency blankets from her trunk. She was a nurse, Thomas learned, working the night shift at Riverside Memorial. She had been on her way to work when Gregory had called her, panicking as his car filled with water. Gregory had not spoken since his question on the embankment. He sat in the back seat of Patricia's car, staring at his hands, at the cuts and bruises that marked his failed attempt to save himself. Thomas gathered his toolbox, preparing to get in his truck and drive home. Wait! Gregory climbed out of the car, walked over to Thomas with unsteady steps. Up close, in the harsh light of the headlights, he looked older than his 35 years. He looked like someone who had just seen death up close and personal and realized how little his success meant in the face of it. I was wrong, Gregory said, about you, about everything I said. He struggled for words, his voice cracking. I was cruel. I was trying to prove something to myself by tearing you down, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Thomas looked at this man who had made him feel worthless hours ago, who had judged his life and found it lacking, who had now been saved by the very person he had despised. I forgive you, Thomas said, and discovered as he said it that he meant it. The words were not easy. They cost him something, required him to surrender the right to bitterness and anger, but they were also freeing, like setting down a heavy weight he had been carrying without realizing it. Gregory's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve that. None of us do, Thomas replied. That's the point. They stood there in the rain for another moment, two men from completely different worlds, connected now by something more profound than either could fully articulate. I'll pay for your tools, Gregory said finally, and for your time tonight, not as charity, as gratitude, as an actual thank you from someone who just learned what it means to need help from someone you wronged. Thomas nodded. Okay. And, Gregory continued, his voice gaining strength, I'd like to make a donation to your daughter's college fund. Patricia told me you mentioned you have a daughter in school. It's not charity. It's me trying to do something right after doing so many things wrong. Thomas wanted to refuse. Pride rose in his throat, the same pride that had made him stand in his garage hours ago, taking Gregory's contempt without defending himself. But then he thought about Melissa, about the loans accumulating interest, about the late nights she spent working at the campus library to make ends meet. "She's studying to be a doctor," Thomas said. "She wants to help people who can't afford good medical care." Gregory smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. "Then I'd say she learned from the best." Patricia drove Thomas home, refusing to let him drive in his condition. Gregory came too, sitting in the back seat, wrapped in his emergency blanket, quiet but present. They pulled up in front of Thomas's apartment as the rain finally began to ease, tapering from a deluge to a steady drizzle. "Thank you," Gregory said as Thomas climbed out, "for my life, for your forgiveness, for showing me that I've been measuring success with the wrong ruler my entire life." Thomas paused at the car door. "You asked me earlier if I ever thought about doing something more with my life. The truth is, I used to. I used to think that maybe I had settled, that maybe I had chosen wrong when I decided to fix engines instead of chasing something bigger." He looked down at his oil-stained hands, his calloused fingers that bore the marks of 29 years of honest labor. "But tonight, I realized that I've been doing exactly what I was meant to do. I fix things. I help people. And maybe that's not impressive by the world's standards, but it's mine, and it's real, and it's enough." "It's more than enough," Gregory said quietly. "It's everything." Thomas nodded and closed the car door. He watched them drive away, taillights disappearing into the rainy darkness, and then he climbed the stairs to his apartment, leaving a trail of water with every step. Inside, he stripped out of his wet clothes for the second time that night, took another shower, and dressed in dry pajamas. He made himself a cup of tea and sat on his couch with his phone in his hand. It was 4:37 in the morning. Melissa would be asleep, but he opened their text conversation anyway, reading back through their recent messages, her complaints about organic chemistry, his terrible dad jokes, her pictures of the campus in fall colors, his reminders to eat vegetables and get enough sleep. He typed a new message. "I love you, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. Not just because you're going to be a great doctor, but because you're already a good person. That matters more than anything else." He hit send and set the phone down. The cross around his neck had left a slight indentation in his skin from the rescue, a temporary mark that would fade by morning. Thomas touched it gently, thinking about his father, about the day he had received this small piece of silver and the words that came with it. "I think I understand now," Thomas said aloud to the empty apartment, to the memory of his father, to whatever or whoever might be listening. "It's not about what we build or how much we earn or how far we climb. It's about what we do when it costs us something. It's about choosing love when hate is easier, forgiveness when bitterness is justified, mercy when revenge is within reach." His phone buzzed. A text from Melissa, awake early to study. "Love you too, Dad. You okay?" That was uncharacteristically deep for 4 a.m. Thomas smiled and typed back, "Just had an interesting night. I'll tell you about it this weekend. Go ace that test." He set the phone down and leaned back against the couch cushions, exhaustion finally catching up with him. Outside, the rain had stopped, and the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Somewhere in Riverside, emergency crews were probably still working to clear the flooded roads. Somewhere, Gregory Ashford was warm and dry and alive, confronting the reality that his money and success had not been enough to save him when it mattered most. And here, in a small apartment that smelled like fried food, living a life that looked small by most measures, Thomas Brennan sat wearing a cross his father had given him and thought about dignity. Real dignity, he realized, had nothing to do with the size of your bank account or the impressiveness of your job title. Real dignity came from knowing who you were, what you believed, and having the courage to live according to those beliefs even when it cost you something. Especially when it cost you something. Thomas closed his eyes and let exhaustion pull him under. He dreamed of engines that ran smoothly, of rain that washed away stains, of a cross that weighed nothing but meant everything, of his daughter in a white coat someday, helping people who could not help themselves. He dreamed of being exactly who he was, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon, Thomas was under the hood of a 1992 sedan when he heard the bell above the garage door chime. He straightened, wiping his hands, expecting to see a customer. Instead, he saw Gregory Ashford standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing jeans and a simple blue shirt that probably cost less than the suit Thomas had first seen him in. He looked different, less polished, less armored, more human. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Gregory said, holding out one of the coffee cups. Thomas took it, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to check in, see how you were doing." Gregory looked around the garage, but this time his gaze held no judgment, only curiosity. "And I wanted to give you this." He pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to Thomas. Inside was a check, not for the donation to Melissa's education, which had already arrived a week ago, but for something else. Thomas looked at the number and felt his breath catch. "What is this?" "It's a grant," Gregory explained. "I've been talking to some colleagues, and we've started a foundation, a fund to help small business owners in the community. We want to help people like you expand, improve their facilities, hire more staff. You're one of the first recipients. There are no strings attached. It's not charity. It's investment in people who've been investing in this community for years without asking for anything in return." Thomas stared at the check, at the number that represented possibilities he had stopped dreaming about years ago. New equipment, a second bay, maybe even hiring back his old assistant full-time. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Gregory replied. "You already saved my life. This is just me trying to pay forward a fraction of what you gave me that night." He paused, then added softly, "You know, I've spent the last 3 weeks thinking about what you said, about measuring success with the wrong ruler. I'm trying to learn a new way to measure. It's harder than I thought it would be." Thomas set the check on his workbench carefully, like it might disappear if handled too roughly. "The fact that you're trying is what matters." They talked for another hour, these 2 men who had met in conflict and been remade in crisis. Gregory told Thomas about his childhood, about a father who had worked himself to death trying to provide, about the anger and fear that had driven him to success at any cost. Thomas told Gregory about his wife, about the loneliness of single parenthood, about the joy of seeing his daughter become someone better than he had ever been. They discovered they had more in common than either had suspected. They were both afraid of failure. They both wanted to matter. They both carried crosses, some visible, some not, and bore them with varying degrees of grace. When Gregory finally left, promising to return the following week to continue their conversation, Thomas stood in his garage and looked around at his small kingdom. The tools worn smooth by years of use, the calendar finally updated to the correct month, the coffee mug that said, "World's okayest dad," which was perhaps the most honest assessment of him that existed. He thought about the night in the rain, about the choice he had made to save a man who had despised him. He thought about forgiveness and grace and the strange arithmetic of mercy, where giving away the thing that cost you the most somehow left you richer than before. Thomas picked up his wrench and returned to the engine he had been working on. There was always another car that needed fixing, always another person who needed help. That was the nature of his work, the rhythm of his days. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, that thought did not make him feel small. It made him feel exactly the right size. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The rain, when it came again that afternoon, sounded different, less like judgment and more like blessing. The cross around his neck caught the light as he bent over the engine, a small glint of silver against the grey of his coveralls, visible and present and exactly where it was supposed to be.